Master with Discover Your Origins. In this video, I'm going to take a look at the 1870 U.S. Census. This is an interesting census because it was the one taken right after the American Civil War. And so if you compare this census with the 1860 census, you can kind of see how things in the country really changed, especially for the population of the southern states. But it's also true for the northern states. You know, Gettysburg in particular happened in Pennsylvania. So I'd be curious to see, the changes that happened there over those 10 years. But let's go and look at the National Archives page and see what it can tell us. So the 1870 census was the 9th census taken in the United States since 1790. The official census day was June 1st, 1870, and it was completed by September 10th, 1870 for the most part. The U.S. Marshals were primarily responsible for actually conducting the census and collecting the statistics. The superintendent of the census was Francis Amasa Walker, and he was underneath the Secretaries of the Interior, Jacob D. Cox and Columbus Delano. So the questions asked on the 1870 census were very similar to the 1850 and 1860 census. There were a few differences. This was one where they also collected information about parents who may have been of foreign birth. There was also some questions about whether somebody was ever denied the right to vote for whatever reason. So there were a few differences, and you can see what the questions were here. So there's a blank form here that you can look at to see what it looked like. You can also download one if you want to use it for transcribing your family. Most all the states that existed at the time were included in the census. There were a few exceptions. The Indian Territory, mostly Oklahoma, there was no census taken. And there were two enumerations taken of 4 areas because of concerns about the count. And I'll explain that a little bit more. But there's 2 enumerations for Indianapolis, New York City, a county in Ohio, and county in Pennsylvania. There are some census records that were missing. So, for example, the federal copy of the census for Minnesota was lost, but the state copy survived. And so when you're looking at Minnesota, you're looking at the state copy and not the federal copy. So you may not realize that there were multiple copies of the census made at the time of the census. So there would be the initial enumerator recording the information, and then they would come back and transcribe what they recorded onto new forms. And so there was a federal copy made and a state copy made. And so you may have as many as 3 copies of a census. But all of the census records, including the state copy for Minnesota, have been digitized and are available for viewing at all of the major sites, like Family Search and Ancestry. So now let's go and look at the statistics for the 1870 census. So one of the reasons there were 2 enumerations for some of the areas in the country was because the overall population growth for this census showed only a 22% increase. Now, if you compare that with the previous censuses, the U.S. was seeing about a 30 to 35% population increase every 10 years. And so when certain municipalities saw what the totals were, they were really concerned because it didn't seem to reflect what they personally knew and were expecting to see. Now, in general, most of the census is considered pretty accurate, but it's possible that there were some discrepancies. And so because of that, they did redo some of the census in 1871. So be sure to look at the date on the enumeration sheets for those localities where there was 2 counts, because there will be some differences or things that you may not be expecting. But because of this concern, there were actually formal charges brought against Francis Amasa Walker, who was the superintendent of that census. And I'm not sure what happened to him, but it was definitely a controversy at the time. There were some other statistics collected for this census regarding agriculture, mortality, social statistics, and that kind of thing. The slave schedule, of course, was not taken because slavery had been abolished. The most populous state was New York, the least populous was Nevada. And you can also see a breakdown of ethnicity with these statistics. And you can look at those on the Wikipedia page here. And then there's some additional state statistics and city statistics. And once again, New York City is the most populous city. All right, so let's go and look at a person who was counted in the 1870 census. And so we're going to look at Drucilla Waits. And we know that she was born in October 1809 in South Carolina. And her death date is assumed. There's no evidence for it being in 1895. And so that date there is questionable. Let's look at the makeup of the family. So you can see here that Drucilla Waits was married to William Langford, and they had 10 children. And if you were to look in the 1850 and even the 1860 census, you would see pretty much all of these children alive and living with William Langford and Drucilla Waits. So if you wanted to see the impact of the American Civil War on a family, this is a really good example because we're going to be taking a look at how many people are in the household in 1870. So let's go and look at the actual census page here. And before we look at the entry for Drucilla, you can see we've got a page number. We have a post office here in Gravelly Springs, Alabama. And if you're not aware, Gravelly Springs was a pretty important place in the American Civil War. There was Wilson's brigade started in Gravelly Springs and headed south through Alabama, which was one of the final battles in the American Civil War. Gravelly Springs was a pretty eventful place, and so you can imagine the people that lived there were impacted quite drastically. So you can see the location is a township with some numbers and letters. That location is actually based off plat maps in the county of Lauderdale in Alabama, and you can see the enumeration date. So let's go down and look at Drucilla, and you can see her right here. For one thing, her last name is not spelled the same as her profile on Family Search, and I think that's just a phonetic spelling. And then she has initials for her first name. You can see that she has valued her property at $400, and the previous census in 1860, their property was valued at about $1,000. So there's been a pretty dramatic decrease in the value of their property. The other thing you may notice about this family group here is you have Drucilla, the mother, and then all of her daughters are here. And then their youngest son, James, who would have been about 7 in 1860. He's 17 now, and he's listed as a farmhand. So he was helping in the family. None of the daughters appear to be married. So like the oldest, Polly, is 38 years old, and Martha, 32, Harriet, 20, Carolyn, 20. And that's not a discrepancy. Those two girls were twins. But notably, the oldest son is missing, another son is missing, and William Langford, Drucilla's husband, is missing. And by looking at the 1866 census for the state of Alabama, we learned that a soldier in the family had died. And so it's possible that the soldier that died was William Langford, Drucilla's husband. Joseph Langford, who's the oldest son, was married and in his own household, but he also dies after the war, or at the end of the war. So this family here has quite a bit of loss. Also, if you look a little bit closer, I always recommend look at the people around your family. You can notice that, let me go to the previous page. Drucilla's brother, James, is right next to her, Drucilla. They're living next to each other. So James is on a farm with that he's valued at $1,000, and he's with his wife and a daughter. And then you'll notice right here below James Waits' family is a listing of people that were probably previous slaves to James. We know in the previous census that James did have slaves. And so these are probably some of those people that he had as slaves. And it's so nice to see them and have them be named and have some information about them, because previously the census didn't record that information, and so here it is now. So lots of things here that you can see have changed for Drucilla. I have written a blog article about this, and you can kind of take a little bit closer look at the questions and missing records, the controversy, and also kind of the analysis that I did for Drucilla Waits in the 1870 census and the transcription with the sources. So if you're interested, take a look. I'll have the link in the description below. I hope that was helpful. Thanks for watching.